Welcome to Chapter 26, Monopoly Behavior. This chapter is really a continuation of the previous chapter where we considered monopoly. Although last chapter we considered the simple, more conventional case where monopolists charge the same price to all customers. In this section, we will consider monopoly behavior when monopolists charge different prices to different customers. And that's described by monopolists with the term price discrimination. There are three basic types of price discrimination, which some particularly unimaginative economists called first, second, and third degree price discrimination. But we'll attach more reasonable names to them as we get through them. First degree price discrimination we could think of as perfect price discrimination. It's the most extreme form of price discrimination, where the monopolist charges a different price to each consumer. Now, if the monopolist is going to charge a different price to each consumer, what they should ideally be able to do is charge each consumer their reservation price, or their maximum willingness to pay. If the monopolist were able to make a separate deal with each customer and charge them their maximum willingness to pay, we would get the monopolist producer surplus looking like it does on the right with the large green triangle versus producer surplus that we see on the left where we have a square, where the monopolist charges a single price P sub M to each consumer and sells the quantity Y sub M. If the monopolist is able to a separate price to each customer, they would be willing to sell to any customer who's willing to pay at least the marginal cost of producing that unit of good. Now, if the monopolist charges each consumer their maximum willingness to pay, what this implies is the monopolist must have excellent information about their customers, must be able to estimate with reasonable accuracy their true willingness to pay. I can think of one example of perfect price discrimination that would be very relevant. At the risk of getting in trouble, I would submit that when private universities, the process of financial aid is in essence perfect price discrimination or first degree price discrimination. When you apply to college, you or your family were required to fill out the FAFSA form, the Federal Financial Aid Form, where you have to disclose your family's income, your family's assets, their savings, any business assets. The university basically knows your complete financial picture. And the reason given for this, universities say, well, this enables us to determine what your appropriate financial aid would be. But if we think about this as cold, heartless economists, what private universities do is they set tuition at an extremely high level and then offer each customer their own unique financial aid package, which high tuition price minus individualized financial aid amounts to a unique price for each person who goes to Baylor. So Baylor uses the information off the FAFSA to try to determine maximum willingness to pay and then charge that. So by doing this, the monopolist is able to capture the entire surplus. It's very, very profitable for universities to do this. Second degree pricing or second degree price discrimination is nonlinear pricing. And what we mean by nonlinear pricing is that you just charge the same for each unit consumed. So the idea would be quantity discounts. So if consumers purchase more units, they are quoted a lower price on additional units consumed. One example that I could think of, when Starbucks first opened on the Baylor campus, Starbucks offered these things called treat receipts. So if you went in early in the morning when you've got to have your coffee to survive and you buy a drink at the full price, you were given a receipt that was stamped with the time and date that you were in. And if you brought that receipt back into Starbucks on the same day after 3 p.m., you could buy a drink that costs the same or less at half price. And what this allowed Starbucks to do, you see this diagram to my, or in the center of the page, it allowed Starbucks to capture that additional square of revenue off to the right. Right? So they get their profit maximizing price and quantity from the people early in the morning, but then by offering a quantity discount, they're able to sell additional units of output at a somewhat lower price and capture more consumer surplus. Electrical utilities also do this. There's some pricing plans that if you consume a certain number of kilowatt hours for additional kilowatt hours purchased, they're quoted at a lower per kilowatt hour rate. Another example that Varian talked about in his text was the monopoly can address the quality of service to engage in price discrimination. And the classic example of this might be the airlines, right? One could imagine that airlines deliberately make flying in coach an unpleasant experience to basically incentivize people with the ability and willingness to pay to upgrade to business. It's all that much more to fly someone in business class, but if you make flying in coach class truly awful, the airline is able to capture more surplus from their customers. And finally, we have third-degree price discrimination, which you could think of alternatively as separable markets. So if a monopolist is selling their unique product in multiple markets and there's no possibility of resale between these markets, this allows the monopolist to charge unique prices in each market, unaffected by what goes on in the other ones. And I would submit that the car market is a wonderful example of this. I had a fun experience as a 19-year-old when I went to Europe in the mid-1980s. And my friend who I went to visit in Germany, knowing that I was a big car head, he took me to the BMW dealer. And BMW had just introduced the new BMW 325 convertible, and I have a picture of it here. And BMW was selling 325 sedans in the US, but they had announced that they were going to offer the convertible for sale in an additional 6 months. But I was over in Germany in the summer of 1985, and it was on sale in Germany. And once this salesman figured out that I was an American, he said, "Oh, we sell our cars to Americans all the time. All we have to do is get a car with US certified bumpers and US certified doors with crash barriers in the side, and you can drive it around while you're here in Europe, and then we'll ship it back to the US, and once it arrives in the US, put a second catalytic converter on it, and it's yours." And of course, my head began to spin. Oh, and he was going to offer it to me at a price of $10,500. And I knew from what I was reading that this car was going to go on sale in the US for probably $25,000, $26,000. So I immediately saw dollars, right? You could see the little dollar sign spinning in my head. And I thought, I could either have the coolest car on campus, or I could basically make a fortune if I bought this car and brought it to the US. And I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to get in real trouble with my dad if I bought this car and attempted to bring it home. So I didn't. But then after getting back home and doing a little bit more research on exactly what it takes to bring a Euro spec car into the US, it turns out it was a good decision. The federal government makes it extremely difficult to bring European spec cars into the US. You have to post bond when your car arrives in the US equal to the value of the car, and then you have 6 months to pass American safety and emission standards, and if you do not do that to the satisfaction of the Customs Bureau, they seize your car and they crush it. So very, very draconian. What this basically means then is that it's hideously expensive to bring a European spec car into the US. The federal government, conveniently for BMW, separates the markets. And BMW, I would argue, has very different images in their home market in Europe versus the US. In Europe, BMWs are just another wonderful high-performance car. There's many of them that are available that Europeans can choose from. But BMW has been absolutely genius in the US, cultivating the reputation for years and years. Their motto was, BMW is the ultimate driving machine, right? So when I was a college kid, if you wanted to be super, super cool, the car to have was the BMW. So Americans had a higher willingness to pay. If Americans had a higher willingness to pay, right? Because if you want to be seen in the ultimate driving machine, you're willing to pay. That means that demand in the US was less elastic than it was in Europe, right? Where BMW had many close substitutes. So you remember from last chapter, we had the markup pricing rule, right? Where price is a function of the marginal cost of production and the price elasticity of demand. I would submit that the marginal cost to BMW of making a car for the US market and one for their home market is more or less the same. But the price elasticity of demand in Europe is dramatically higher than it is in the US. That'll end the fact that cars cannot be resold between markets means that BMW can charge 2.5 times the price in the US as they do in Europe. Very eye-opening for me, the car guy. A couple additional examples if cars don't do it for you. Student discounts at movie theaters. I would submit that the reason why theaters give discounts to students is not that they particularly love you. I'm sorry to break this to you. It's not that they have great affection for students and sympathy for you. It's that theater owners realize that students are much more price elastic. You guys respond to changes in price, right? When my kids were younger, if they saw ads for a particular new animated film and they wanted to see it, I had to take them to the theater to see that particular movie, right? When Toy Story came out, right? We had to go see Toy Story. Didn't matter what it costs. So my willingness to pay is much higher than that of a college student. So movie theaters charge different prices to students versus non-students because it's profit maximizing. The Golden Corral offers discounts to seniors. This one's particularly funny to me. The Golden Corral is my mom's favorite restaurant. My mom is 95, and this last summer I took my mom to the Golden Corral. And you might ask, does the Golden Corral give discounts to seniors because they care about seniors, because they love seniors, because seniors don't eat as much as anyone else? I would submit that none of those are true. In fact, you should have seen how much food my mom ate and all her other 95-year-old friends. They eat as much as you, the college student, eats. The reason why the Golden Corral gives discounts to seniors is because they are on limited budgets and they watch their pennies. They respond to changes in price. If a restaurant gives a senior discount, Granny and all her friends go get that discount. So it's a matter of profit maximization. A really political issue that comes up every election. Why is it that the same life-saving drugs that are developed and sold in the US sell for 50% less in Canada? Well, I would argue you this is another example of third-degree price discrimination. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration prohibits the re-importing of drugs from Canada to the U.S. What this means then is the federal government has conveniently created segmented markets. The U.S. and the Canadian market are completely separate. So, drug companies can charge radically different prices in the US and Canada and get away with it. The two-part tariff is where there's a per unit price and then a admission price. And we think, so the classic example of this would be Disneyland. So when you think of how Disney prices admission to their parks versus going to traveling carnival that shows up for Independence Day. Most traveling carnivals that I'm familiar with, there's no admission fee, right? They don't have a fence around it. Basically, you walk up, you pay the price, you ride the ride. So Uncle Bill, if he prices as a monopolist, right, he should basically charge the monopoly price. So he charges P sub M, he sells P sub M ride, revenue given by the green square on the left. Disney, on the other hand, if the marginal cost of an additional ride is essentially zero, right? So if you would argue that all these rides are running anyway, and the cost of putting one more person on Space Mountain is essentially zero, what that means then is if someone were to enter Disney and ride as many rides as they want, they generate consumer surplus given by this green triangle in the center of the slide. Because that consumer surplus would be the gain that the consumer gets from entering Disney and riding as many rides as they want to. That represents the maximum amount that Disney could charge for admission to the park. So if they do marginal cost pricing, right, they charge consumers the price of each additional ride, and then they charge consumer surplus for admission to the park, Disney is able to successfully extract the entire amount of consumer surplus from each consumer that enters the park, which I would suggest they have demonstrated a lot of doing. In the perfectly competitive market, we talked about firms being price takers. Right? They have no ability to set their own prices, and the reason because of this was that in the perfectly competitive market, products were assumed to be homogeneous. Right? The example that I gave at the time was my dad, the wheat farmer. His wheat was just like the wheat that the neighbor grew. They were indistinguishable from one another, and because they were indistinguishable, that meant that both of them were price takers. If products are not all the same, in other words, they're different, what that means then is demand curves now are not horizontal for the individual firm, but they slope downward, right? So if a product is different customers have different willingness to pay for this unique product. So product differentiation can be a very effective way for firms to enhance their profit. To the extent that they can convince you their product really is different, that gives the firm the ability to charge higher than marginal cost pricing. So the examples that I've given here, each one of these examples, we have firms that have engaged in substantial amounts of consumer advertising to convince you that their good is different and unique than their competitors, right? Dr. Pepper is different and better than Coke or Pepsi, right? Starbucks is better than these local these local coffee houses. I remember, just to go to the car example, Chevron for years said that they had this additive called Techron put in their gasoline, and you could drive your engine clean with Chevron with Techron. It was better than that stuff sold by Mobil or Valero. So to the extent that each one of these firms can make that argument believable to customers, there are customers that have higher willingness to pay, and it's profitable. So under this regime, we get the monopolistically competitive model. And the attributes of it on the left, we have a large number of firms and no barriers to entry or exit like the perfectly competitive model, but now we have product differentiation. So firms engage in the optimal amount of product differentiation, which causes their demand, the firm demand curve, to slope downward, but entry and exit drives firm profits to zero. So you get this diagram like in the center of this slide, right? The firm chooses the quantity of output where marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. They charge maximum willingness to pay, but entry into the market of closely related firms drives profits to zero. The hoteling model of location competition is another kind of cute old model that has a variation. It's a variation of the same theme. So suppose that two food trucks want to locate along a busy mile-long beach. So imagine you go to Galveston. If you go along Seawall Drive, it's about a mile long. It's a very busy beach. So suppose that beachgoers are uniformly distributed over this beach, and customers will go to whichever food truck is closer to where they are on the beach. Where should the two food trucks locate to maximize their profit? And I submit, somewhat counterintuitively, they should locate right next to each other in the middle. And we could give a variant proof why this should be true, right? Suppose not. What if food truck A moved a little bit to the left? So if we assume that consumers are distributed uniformly over the beach, and customers go to the food truck that's closest to where they're located, the customers that now are between A's new location somewhat to the left and B's location in the middle, there will be some customers between those two locations, and food trucks A and B will split them 50-50. But food truck B still gets everyone to the right of them. So B is able to dramatically increase its market share if A moves to the left. So basically, a firm that moves away from the center will lose market share. Equilibrium is that they both should locate right next to each other in the middle. The hoteling model for years, I guess just to tell a political story, this used to be the model to describe the type of political candidates that each party would nominate for the presidential election. Right? So suppose that we have voters that we could measure by ideology from left to right. And suppose that voters are distributed uniformly across this axis, and that voters will vote for the candidate who's closest to their ideology. So if we apply the hoteling model, what we would say then is that the equilibrium strategy for each political party is to nominate someone from the ideological middle, right? So everyone to the left of A votes for A, everyone to the right of B votes for B, and if you have deviation from that, then you have the same story as talking about with the food trucks on Galveston Beach. Well, I would submit that we haven't really seen this for the last 30-40 years. That's the last time I can think of a middle-of-the-road candidate being nominated to the presidency and winning. And the reason for that is that voters in America, I would really aren't uniformly distributed by ideology anymore. So the assumptions aren't there, and the model breaks down. But interesting nonetheless. So on to quiz questions. First one, Ferdinand Sludge has this book that costs $2. So the marginal cost is $2 for printing an additional copy. And we have two markets, the US and England, and suppose that they're separable. So what Sludge should do is he should treat the US and England as separate monopoly markets, charge the monopoly price in each, and the question asks, what is the difference between the price charged in England and the US? And we just treat each one like it's a good old-fashioned monopoly. Right? So in the US, starting on the left, we have demand, we invert it, then we get marginal revenue. You remember we take P1 multiplied by Q1 to get total revenue in the US, differentiate with respect to Q1 to get marginal revenue, set it equal to marginal cost. We solve for quantity and the price in the US. And we should do the same thing in England, and you can see that the price differential should be 8. This one is perfect price discrimination, and I would suggest in this question to draw the picture, right? So we draw demand. We know that the perfect price discriminator is going to sell to anyone who is willing to pay at least marginal cost. So the quantity sold is where the demand curve intersects marginal cost. We have 32 units sold, and then each unit sold, they charge the reservation price. So the total revenue of this firm would be the upper triangle that's shaded green. Right? So you have 32 units sold, a different price to each unit, and it's captured by this area. So as usual, 1/2 base times height. Very straightforward. And finally, we have a two-part tariff problem. We have Elvis Land, and 3,000 people are interested in going. We have a demand function for each person interested in going, and we have a marginal cost for providing a ride. So notice in this case, the marginal cost of a ride is $1. So it's so what we know then is that the owners of Elvis Land should engage in marginal cost pricing, so they should charge $1 per ride. So that eliminates options C, D, and E. We know that $1 per ride will be charged, and the question is, how much should the admission fee be? Well, the admission fee should be the producer surplus or consumer surplus that's generated when $1 per ride is charged and people ride as many rides as they would like. So I draw the picture just like from the previous one. So in this case, if $1 is charged per ride, we know that each entrant into the park is going to choose to ride 4 rides, and the admission fee is equal to consumer surplus, which is the triangle, 1/2 base times height. So the entrance fee should be $8. So that does it for monopoly behavior. The next chapter will be on oligopoly. Thanks.